So I'll turn then to the first of our three speakers. We'll maintain the rest of the order as published on the program. So it's a real privilege to introduce Dr. Erling Norrby, who had a career as professor of virology at the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, and served as the dean of the Faculty of Medicine, and has had a remarkable series of roles related to the Nobel Prize as well, including spending 6 years as the permanent secretary of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. So he's been involved initially in the prizes on physiology or medicine, and then on the prizes in physics and chemistry. And he's the author of 5 books related to the history of the Nobel Prizes, life sciences. And the talk today draws from this broader scope of research and experience, as well as from Erling's time as a Sidney Brenner Fellow. So with that, welcome, Erling, and thank you.
Well, thank you for that introduction. It's a great pleasure to join you for this particular event, and for several reasons, actually. Cold Spring Harbor, one of my favorite environments, and for 15 or so years, I was participating in or leading conferences on viral vaccines and so forth, and I always enjoy the unique environment that you have there. And I've been visiting many times and look like this opportunity to keep in touch with a fantastic environment. As mentioned, I have written so far 5 books about Nobel Prizes, and the last one covered the years of 1969 to 71. And I mentioned that because then I wrote about Max Delbruck and Luria and these 3 prize recipients. And actually, there was a lot about Cold Spring Harbor, because Spring Harbor was the place where molecular biology was born, because when it was finally realized that maybe even viruses have genes, and one could start to do the critical experiments which were made by these people, including Hershey, of course, who spent his whole career, or his later part of his career at the Cold Spring Harbor. And the other thing I'm proud of is to be a recipient of a Sidney Brenner scholarship, because I've had the privilege of learning to know Sidney personally. I've spent a lot of my time out in California at UCSD and at Scripps, and Sidney was very often in that environment, and I met him in many other contexts. In fact, I met him 3 weeks before he died out in Singapore. That was a very memorable and an emotional meeting. So what I will talk to you about is the Nobel Prizes and the archives of the Nobel Prizes, which I would argue are world unique. So the whole prize is based on a will that Alfred Nobel had written, and that was opened when he died on December 10th in 1896. And that's, of course, the reason why we always hand out the Nobel Prize on December 10th. It's his death day. That will also cause a lot of complication, because it's handwritten and it was made without any legal consulting. And the problem was not, well, he wanted to give out 5 different prizes. That was clear and that was well defined. But the problem was there was no one to receive the money and to take care of the money and to really manage the whole operation. So it took 4 years before one could get started in delivering Nobel Prizes. And that was based on the creation of something called the Nobel Foundation. So the Nobel Foundation manages the money. It also takes care of the legal aspect of the prize, and it also arranges the feast on December 10th each year. So in 1901, one could start to hand out the first Nobel Prize. But how would one go to go about that? Well, the challenges were different in different places. So the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, responsible for the prize in physics and in chemistry. So, and remember, in those times, I think there were about 4 professors of physics in the whole Sweden. And it was quite a daunting challenge to structure this and to merely make appropriate choices. Anyhow, one got started in 1901. And then, of course, in order to do this work, you need to create a Nobel Committee. So this Nobel Committee, as it got started, it usually had about 5 members. And the process had a very clearly timeline, and I would like to emphasize this maybe as a starter, that how do we manage this in a time frame. The first thing that is important is that only people invited to nominate for prize can do that. And so hence the Academy sent out invitations and to professors of physics in Sweden and in Scandinavian countries, and to, I guess in the beginning, a rather small circle, but selected scientists. And those letters of invitation are sent out in September, and only someone who's been invited to nominate can nominate. So as you can understand, at the beginning, there was rather small numbers of nominations, but it did catch on as soon as one got started with this prize. And one in physics, so I want to talk about that, because it started out with a good prize to sit with the Röntgen, and that was really on the very spectacular of its time. Now, so the nominations, they should be submitted before the end of January. And that applies to all prizes. And then the work by the committee can start. So one reviews this submitted nominations and decides on various kinds of reviews. And this has had many different characters depending upon which prize we talk about. And I will, of course, in this I will stick to the prizes in the natural sciences. But there is also a 4th prize for literature. And that was quite a problem in the beginning, because this literature according to Nobel should be an educative nature. So, of course, one missed Tolstoy and Ibsen and Strindberg in the first 10 years, but later on, it has improved. And then there's a peace prize, which is the recipient of that is selected by a committee under the House Parliament in Norway, in Oslo. And at the time when this prize was started in 1900, Sweden and Norway formed a union. But it's a prize that's been very much debated, and it also doesn't have the solid structure that I would argue that we have for the prizes in natural science. So there are 2 prizes, in physics and in chemistry, that is taken care of by the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. And for that, we have a committee, and I think at the beginning we have 3, and then we're going to have 5 members. And they review the submitted nominations and try to invite colleagues to make written reviews. In the beginning, all this, of course, was in Swedish. And then the committee meets and try to come up with a proposal. And that proposal is then exposed to what we have a class for physics and we have a class for chemistry at the academy. So that class scrutinizes the proposal and says that they like the proposal or they want to discuss it further. And then once they have agreed, the class and the committee, then it's submitted to a vote, and then every member of the academy has a vote. So, but you need to keep well informed about that. But let me take this into how we manage it today, because there has been a fantastic development. And maybe one could say that because it's been taken very seriously, and one has mobilized all the best scientists in Sweden for this, overall, the choices have been respected by the scientific community. And of course, this has major implications also for the way the science are pursued in Sweden. So the committee, when it works with the proposals, it can make in-depth reviews, or it could argue that this is a very strong proposal. And so they tend to distill this out. And when during the month of August, many of professors associated with the Nobel work spend most of their free time writing these reviews, and with the best of the knowledge that they have. And towards the end of September, one gathers all these reviews into a book volume. And I can tell you, I have the privilege, a member, that I can collect this book in the beginning of September, both for physics and chemistry, and physics is usually beyond my insight, but chemistry is quite important to me. And it is a remarkable the way it has developed and the way what kind of material it is. So first of all, the scale has increased with time, not unexpectedly, and that's partly also because when I keep respect for the selection of prize recipients. So just to take the year 2023, we invited 3,000 people to nominate, and we got 450 nominations for a single prize. And they included then 464 candidates, so it's quite a challenge to try to put that out. 20 of those were for the first time, and therefore probably, I know that today one usually wait for a second nomination before one starts reviewing a candidate. But the way the committee works is that it uses it prepares its own reviews, it invites reviews, and then they concentrate on distilling out what the candidate for the year. But in this material, both in physics and chemistry, they usually make 5 particularly strong candidates and give those an extra description, and then they come to propose that out of these 5, we would like this one particular candidate for this year. Originally was thought to be the one person, but with time, it was clear that very often one needed to have at least 2 candidates, and coming into the 30s, one even had 3 or person proposed prize. But there one cut the limit, so we cannot give to more than 3 people. Theoretically, at the academy, one can in fact give to organizations, but that's never been done. It could have been considered when, for example, one gave a prize for the Higgs boson, gave to the 2 people, physicists that had identified or projected that it should exist, but one didn't give a prize to CERN, and one could have given that's an organization a third recipient. This material, which the book, so which today comes up to, let's say, just checked recently the book for chemistry, and up about 450 pages, and then it's a fantastic material because it's a real-time analysis of knowledge, the way we today, and try to compare different knowledge. So in the end of August, when you get, or in the mid that time, then the committee confronts the class of physics or the class of chemistry, depending upon the prize. And if the class supports the proposal by the committee, then one agrees then one have an agreement on candidate for the year, and then the academy can go into the vote on the prize. And at this vote, all members of the academy have one vote. So it is a golden opportunity to inform yourself as far as you can of the developments in the field of physics and in chemistry, and to vote on that. Now, if we now go to the prize in physiology or chemistry, no, physiology or medicine, and notice that this is the formulation that Alfred Nobel used, and he was probably influenced by some collaborative work we had with one physiologist from the Karolinska Institute who worked with him in Paris. So it highlights physiology and basic biology, and it highlights medicine. Sometimes we have discussions. We have our clinical colleagues who want to see more prizes on the applied section and it's compared to those in the theoretical section. So if we look at the Karolinska Institute, the way a recent year, there are about 700 nominations in the last years. And the operating committee at the Karolinska Institute is 5 members that evolved during the early 1960s. And these are appointed for 3 and then plus 3 years. But the field of medicine is so large that one has 10 adjunct members. So the operating committee is 15 people when it came to Karolinska Institute. And in fact, in 1901, the Karolinska Institute was not an independent university, but it had been appointed to have this responsibility, and then they had something called the College of Teachers. That was to take the decision, but probably some 20 people. So in the early phase, it was very much dependent upon what authorities there were in different fields of medicine and so forth. Then with time, the Karolinska Institute became full medical faculty of a university. In fact, it's an independent institute. Using the Karolinska Institute, it's simply a school of medicine, and it's run by the government completely. And then there was the faculty of medicine that took the final decision. But there were some discussions about the possibility of keeping all this material secret, because it's a governmental run university, and therefore, by definition, should the material that is used or produced at the university should be open to anyone. So one did a technical construct in 1978. One created something called the Nobel Assembly. The Nobel Assembly has 50 members. And at the time, we were 54 professors. And so one had to trim that down. But that exists today. And it gives some very nice proportions. A committee of 5 plus 10 makes the groundwork, comes out with written proposal reflecting all the various reviews that have been made. But there is one little difference from physics and chemistry, which I think is an omission. I look at it from the historical perspective, and that is that at the Karolinska Institute, the reviews that one makes, one come up with this person is worthy of a Nobel Prize, not as yet worthy, or not worthy of a Nobel Prize. And that number is probably in the order of 50 or more. So it's not very helpful. You need to have this communication between the committee and the Nobel Assembly these days. But that works out quite very well, kind of balance with 15 people. But from someone uses it as an archival material, there's very little guidance. One cannot see from the way the committee makes it based discussions why they have selected a particular candidate a certain year. In contrast, as I mentioned, in physics and chemistry, they highlight some 5 or 6 top candidates, top group. But the Karolinska Institute, this is not available. But it all depends on the trust that you have between the committee of 15 people and the Nobel Assembly of 15 people. But it does indeed work out very well. And so why has this material been of such a great interest to me? When in the beginning, it wasn't clear if one could be allowed to use this material for science historical work. But then became clear in the 60s and 70s, this was a very precious material. And then one introduced the rule that there's a 50-year secret. And when 50 years has passed, you can make a request to the secretary of the committee, say, I would like to study this for this and particular purposes. And then you can get the right to do that. And then when you start to look at this, you realize that this is an absolutely exceptional, real-time presentation of knowledge. You can imagine that if you today would take 50 years back and think about what did we know or did we not know, that would be very, very hard to gauge that properly. So what happened was that when I was the permanent secretary of the Academy, I gave quite a lot of lectures on 100 years of Nobel Prizes and so forth. And then Stanley Proust, who in 1998 got the Nobel Prize for this work on prion, he said he was interested in the prize for cultivation of poliovirus in 1950. And so I asked for permission to look at that, and then Stan came to Stockholm, and I had translated all the Swedish text into English so that he could understand that. And then we got a fascinating insight into that particular plan. I won't bore you with the details. It turned out John Enders, who was the leader of the group, he had been nominated for that. Thomas Weller and Frederick Robbins, they were nominated for the first time in 1954. But my predecessor, Professor of Virology at Karolinska Institute, Sven Gard, he had informed himself very well, and he argued very strongly that this prize should be given to the 3 of them, although 2 of them had been nominated for the first time that year. The committee decided that they wanted to give a prize to chemist Sainte Vigneault, who had synthesized 2 hormones, rather small hormones, but a great chemical work. And I know from the personal contact that Sven Gard was very proud because he managed to convince the College of Teachers that they should not follow the proposal. They should instead give a prize for polio, for the capacity of poliovirus. And that was a very, very fundamental discovery because it opened up the whole field. There was a strange dogma for a long, long time said that poliovirus can only grow in nerve cells. Turned out to be wrong. But it took more than 50 years to understand that it was wrong. And it was a very typical kind of serendipitous finding because it was in 1949 and Thomas Weller wanted to try to grow varicella virus in tissue culture. And then they said, we need to have a control. So they took as a control material some mouse polio. And of course, varicella virus didn't, but the polio virus very happily in either fibroblast or epithelium. Here was a dogma that came way back in history. It which said that polyvirus can only grow in nerve cells, but it was wrong. It can grow in fibroblasts. And all this open up the field, and therefore one could give this Nobel Prize, but I think it's a very, very strong Nobel Prize if you look at the consequences. We have almost eradicated polio now. So encouraged by that, I wrote another article about the 1951 Nobel Prize, Max Tyler, yellow fever vaccine. Turned out to be fascinating material to work with, and that got me going. And my first book was published in 2010, included these reviews and some other materials that I collected over the year. From there on, I have been just taking the pace of 3 years at a time. So I wrote about crisis in physiology or medicine, mostly 60, 61, 62, and that gave a book then in 2014, and that's been going on like that. And you can imagine if you're going to search for something to do in your time of retirement, this is a great challenge. Absolutely. And I will just actually, it was towards the end of my presentation, because so they had developed a book about 400, 450 pages every third year. So we're talking about 1914, on the 17, on the 20, and then 23, 22. So I'm working on the sixth book now, just to illustrate what kind of interesting challenges there are. Now I'm writing about both price chemistry and in medicine in 1972. And in chemistry, tries to Anfinsen, Moore, and Stein on protein folding. The way I approach that, I discuss how one comes to this conclusion, but then I extrapolate into the future, because a lot of things happen in protein folding, and you can therefore give a historical perspective, and you can tell what happened then. In medicine, it was a prize for the structure of IgG, very fundamental, by Edelman and Porter. 2 heavy chains, 2 light chains, the operational explanations that were provided by. And right now I'm working on the 1973 press, because this material I can open in 2024. So it was from January this year. And what I want just to mention to you there briefly is that so happened that I became professor of virology in 1972. And my predecessor, Sven Gard, that I mentioned briefly, was very influential in the Nobel work. So for some reason, the committee said, well, let's try that new professor in virology as an adjunct member in 1973. So in 1973, it was the first year when I worked in the Nobel Committee, and first of more than 20 years. So when I open this from 1973, I can read my own evaluations. So you can see that the kind of like closing the circle. And what I want to highlight in this presentation is that I think there's no corresponding historical material in which you can find a real-time evaluation of what's happening in physics, chemistry, physiology, or medicine. Okay, so I'll put finish there and then open up for questions.
Thank you very much. Please, to the audience members, if you have a question, use the reaction tab at the bottom of your screen to raise your hand, and I'll ask you to unmute yourself. So if anyone has a question, please use the reaction button.
Yeah.
You may have to create a full-size Zoom screen in order to find the reaction button, and then you can raise your hand from there. Nathaniel.
Yeah, Nathaniel is says his town, right?
Let
Hi,
me Yeah.
Thank you, Erling. A lot of really fascinating history of the Nobel Prize here. I had a question. This raises a whole lot of questions in my mind. I'll restrict myself to one, and that is the. Can you clarify the policy on posthumous Nobel Prizes? I know there have been a couple, but they've all been under kind of extenuating circumstances. Can you clarify what the policy is on posthumous prizes?
So in principle, you cannot give a prize posthumously. We had a very embarrassing situation about 4 or 5 years ago when we gave a prize in immunology. And it turned out that that person had died, I think, 3 or 4 days before we announced the prize. And we weren't aware of the fact that he had died. So in that situation, one made a kind of compromise and said, oh, we were not aware of this, and therefore did that. So his wife came, received this prize in a very, very graceful, nice way. But in principle, you cannot give posthumously. However, you have given to Dag Hammarskjöld in a peace prize. You gave him a literature prize, also posthumously, to Karlfeldt. But you adhere to the rules, prize cannot be given posthumously.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Erling? Erling, if I may ask you a question myself. So
Please.
I know we have a lot of fellow audience members and speakers here who are especially interested in the life sciences. If you were to consider the way the prize has been awarded across the 20th century in physiology or medicine and related things in chemistry, would you draw any general conclusions about the type of research perhaps that's been valued at different times across the 20th and into the 21st century? Any patterns of what you think has been valued in terms of research or topics that might be a kind of historical trend that you've identified through the research?
Yeah, it's a very, very important question. I've written quite a lot about that. So when we started with the prizes, Germany was the dominating country when it comes to natural sciences, and they retrieved about 40% of the awards. And then the United States, very, very few prizes in the early phase. Then came the interruptions and perturbations of the First World War, and then came the Second World War. And the impact of the Second World War with the anti-Semitism and so forth, that forced a lot of people with a Jewish background to go to the United States and to develop their science there, led to a dramatic change. So we, each year, we predict that 70% of all Nobel Prizes in natural sciences, they go to the United States. Competition is increasing, of course, not the least from Asia, from Japan and other countries, but still, I must really praise the American science because there's something is done very, very appropriately. But there is one more aspect to this, and I just will leave that with you, and I cannot really fully myself grasp it. If you look at the percentage of Nobel laureates in physics that have a Jewish background, you find that at 25%. If you look at those who get prize in chemistry, about 16%. Or you look at physiology or medicine, you find 25%. How large is the Jewish population, global Jewish population? And what really puzzled me, it's so overwhelming because the value is a factor of 100 when it comes to overrepresentation of people with a Jewish background. Why is that? That can be discussed forever, but then they are overperforming in science, they do in other, like in the humanities and so forth, in a remarkable way. And I wish I could understand, because we could perhaps learn something. What is it that makes them so creative? But think about a factor of 100, not a two-fold, it's 100.
Thank you
And
very,
you
very much,
profit on
Erling.
that because, yeah, you profit on that because a lot of institutes, of course, establish themselves in the United States, integrated into excellent environments, and got the resources they needed to develop them unique talents.
Yeah. My mind is racing to various works of scholarship about the ways that that anti-Semitism shaped the access to particular subfields, for example, within physics in the late 19th and early 20th century. But unfortunately, it's urgent for us to move on now to keep on schedule with our next talks. So thank you very much to Erling. And now